one other thing that I want to mention, and this is, when let's say, for example, somebody says, with regard to royalties, we're gonna pay you 5% of profit. I mean, and I always say, that is the most manipulated. Actually, profit can be manipulated. So if I'm gonna pay you 5% of profit, I mean, I can easily tell you that I haven't made any profit. So that is why it's important to understand the basis on which the royalty is going to be calculated, but also have the right to be able to review the books so that, the other party does not get away with murder.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that is very important. And I mean, just hearing 5% of profits, I'm like, okay, that's great. I mean, wow, 5%. Meanwhile, yes, it could actually be zero profit. So you also touched on the importance of confidentiality clauses in the agreement. But what about non-disclosure agreements? Like, where do they fit in? Because we also discussed that in our previous post. So now I'm just curious, where do NDAs feature in this whole scheme of things?
Okay, so an NDA, obviously, in most instances, you will conclude it prior to, let's say, a commencement of a license agreement or a project. So you're basically saying to the other party, we would like to engage. There's certain information that I'm going to disclose to you, so I would like you to keep that. I would like you to keep that information confidential. Then we conclude a non-disclosure agreement. However, what I've seen, and I think it's a wrong perception where people assume that just because we've concluded a non-disclosure agreement, it means that that agreement now covers the project. That agreement now covers foreground IP, and that's not the case. This agreement is only saying that what you're going to tell me, I'm going to keep it confidential. So it is important that either you include a project agreement that will include non-disclosure provisions, or you include a non-disclosure agreement plus a project agreement that will regulate, the foreground IP that is going to be to emanate from that project. So don't make assumption that a non-disclosure agreement actually has covered, the entire project. That's normally not the case.
Okay, and can you just give us a quick description of what foreground IP is?
Foreground IP, there is what we call background IP. Background IP is IP that you have created before commencement of a project. Yeah? Then we call that background IP. Then foreground IP is going to be IP that you are going to generate from the beginning of the project moving forward. And that is what we call foreground IP. So background IP is what you are bringing into the project because you have maybe created it last year or during another a period. But now that we are starting on a particular project, the IP that is going to be generated from that project, we call it foreground IP.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for that explanation. So I'm curious to know, after signing this NDA, is there an expiration date for until when I need to keep this confidentiality?
I think a lot of people are not going to be happy with this. Yes, you can put a term to when it must expire, but I always say, and I always recommend that you need to say that the confidentiality provisions must not expire.
Really?
What do I mean by that? Yes. So I'm saying to you, Kutlwano, I'm going to tell you about my technology. And I wanted to keep the information about my technology confidential indefinitely. As long as that information is not available to the public, you have no right to disclose that information to the public. Because if I put a term, I'm basically saying, Kutlwano, I'm going to tell you about my technology. And after 2 years, you are free to go and tell people about my technology.
Okay.
So, do you see why I recommend that? It means it must, you don't have to put a term. And because as long as the information is still confidential, there is no need for you the receiving party to disclose my information. But I know a lot of people are not, if you have a receiving party, they might not agree to it. So then try to put a term of about 10 years or 15 years, but I wouldn't recommend somebody concluding a non-disclosure agreement of about 1 year. Or yeah. I would like to mention also, when you, for example, you conclude an employment contract. And I always recommend and say, in an employment contract, make sure that you have confidentiality provisions. However, make sure that the confidentiality provisions, they do not terminate when the employment terminates. And it's because, let's say I'm now employed by Chayama Shabela Attorneys, and after 2 years, I leave their employment. If the confidentiality provisions do not terminate with my employment contract, it means after 2 years, I can then go and freely start talking, disclosing the firm's confidential information. So it is important for confidentiality provisions to, to go beyond or to survive termination of employment contract. In that way, even if I'm no longer working for you, I'm still bound, or I'm still obligated to keep the information confidential.
So now, that being said, can you tell us some of the most interesting license agreements you've worked on?
Sure. Yeah, we've worked on, different types of agreements. I think one I can think of, which I think maybe, people will be able to relate, is where we concluded a contract with, with Mnet on behalf of our client, and where, Mnet was given the rights to be able to exploit our clients' copyrighted material. So I think that was exciting. And that's an interesting contract, because it related to copyright, and a lot of people think that you cannot commercialize copyright, which is a topic of for another day. Another one that we concluded was against one of the big sport brands, and we were representing a South African institution where the sport brand wanted to use our clients' IP as well, and they wanted to collaborate with our client. So that was also exciting, because it was in the sport industry, which is also, you think that there's no IP there, but there is IP. So I think that those are the two that I can think of that people will interest people. So yeah.
Thank you very much for the time that you've put aside to talk to us about license agreements and other important elements of contracts in general.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity.
All right.
Yeah.